When we first started dating, I could talk to him for hours. We would lie on the floor in his apartment, eat pizza straight from the box, laugh at silly memes, and discuss everything: politics, childhood, fears, even what would happen in 10 years. I liked that he didn't interrupt. He always listened, asked questions, remembered the little things. Back then, I felt like this was the person I could be myself with. No filters, no pretense. The first years of marriage were the same. We talked about everything: how to get a mortgage, what to name the dog, where to go in the summer. Even when we argued, there was something lively about it. We could fight, then laugh through our tears and go out for ice cream. Everything seemed real. But then something changed. Not right away. It was just that one day I noticed that our conversations had become shorter. He started to get tired more quickly, and I started to get offended more often. In the evening, instead of laughter and conversation, we had the TV. We ate dinner in silence, each on our own side of the couch. When I tried to tell him something about my work, he nodded without looking up from his phone. Cool. That was it. And I caught myself starting to talk less. Because what was the point? I kept thinking it was just a phase. That he was burned out. That work was getting to him. That everything would go back to normal. But weeks turned into months, and an invisible wall grew between us. Sometimes I imagined what we looked like from the outside. The perfect suburban couple. A house, 2 cars, barbecues on the weekends. But inside, silence. Not angry, not loud. Just quiet. A silence that began to sound louder than any words. And the scariest thing was that I didn't know when it all started. There was no before and after. One day, I just realized that he had become a stranger. Not because he did anything, but because he stopped being there. Not physically, but emotionally. And that was probably when I felt lonely for the first time. Real loneliness, not the kind that can be cured by parties or phone calls to friends. Loneliness in marriage is when someone is sleeping next to you, but you still feel alone. We still lived as if everything was normal. In the morning, he poured himself coffee into the same mug, white, with a crack on the handle. I toasted bread, sliced avocado, and sprinkled it with lemon as always. We sat across from each other at the kitchen island, listening to the news in the background. Sometimes he would say, "We need to go to Costco." And I would nod. And that was it. That was our dialogue. Outside, everything looked perfect. Even on Instagram, people would write, "What a beautiful couple." And I would catch myself thinking that it wasn't about us. It was about the version that remained in the photo. The one where we smile, but no longer feel it. We continued to go to friends' parties, smiled, held hands, almost automatically. It became a habit. To smile so that no one would ask questions. We knew how to be together for others, but we no longer knew how to be together in reality. Sometimes I noticed how he was becoming more and more distant. He could sit next to me on the couch, scrolling through his phone, and I would look at him and realize he was somewhere far away. Maybe thinking about work. Maybe just in another world where I wasn't. And I did the same thing. I buried myself in TV shows, my phone, my work. It was easier than trying to talk. One day I asked myself, when did our rituals turn into a performance? When did going to the movies become just another item on the calendar? When did dinner together cease to be a moment of intimacy and become an obligation? Probably when we started living on autopilot. When habit replaced feelings and comfort became a trap. We were comfortable together, just not alive. I sometimes imagined that someone would turn off the lights, and we would be left in complete darkness. No screens, no distractions. Would we be able to talk about anything? Or would we just sit there, not knowing where to start? Back then, I didn't know that silence could be louder than a scream. That it slowly destroys, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a drop falling on a stone. A little bit every day. And then one day I caught myself thinking, we no longer live together, we just share space. The house, the refrigerator, the internet bill. Everything else is separate. I tried for a long time to get us back together. Not loudly, not through arguments, just step by step, quietly. I started conversations. I talked about work, about books, about how I felt out of place. I wanted him to hear something between the lines. But most of the time he just nodded. Or said, You're overcomplicating things. Once I asked, "Are you happy?" He didn't even look up from his laptop. "I think so. Are you?" I didn't know how to answer. The word stuck in my throat, because yes would be a lie, and no would be an admission that everything was falling apart. Sometimes I made dinner. I lit candles and cooked his favorite pasta with seafood. He smiled and said, "It's delicious," but the table felt empty. We ate in silence. The whole scene would have looked beautiful in a photo, the perfect dinner in the suburbs. But there was no real togetherness in it. I tried to be interesting. I signed up for photography classes, went running in the mornings, updated my wardrobe. But it was all like trying to get the attention of someone who had long since looked away. Sometimes I would text him during the day, just to say I missed him. He would reply a few hours later, "Sorry, I'm swamped at work." At some point, I stopped writing. Not out of resentment, but out of exhaustion. I remember the evening when he asked, "Is everything okay?" And I smiled and said, "Of course." But inside everything was screaming, because I wanted to say, "No, it's not okay. I miss us. I miss you. I miss the way you used to look at me." But I didn't say it, because I didn't know if he would hear me. Inside I felt empty, not like after a fight, but differently, as if all the words I could say had run out. I just stopped trying. I stopped knocking on a closed door. Sometimes late at night, I would lie next to him and think, maybe this is what adult love is. Not passion, not talking until morning, but just peace? But then why does this peace feel like loneliness? I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that this happens to everyone, that people just get quieter with age. But deep down, I knew we were losing each other. We were just pretending that we weren't. Alex appeared somehow unnoticed. He was just there, at work at the next desk, with coffee in his hands and a tired smile. We weren't close. At first, it was just casual conversation at the coffee machine. "How was your weekend? How's the report coming along?" Nothing special. But it was precisely in this nothing special that there was something else, attention. Genuine, informal attention. He knew how to listen. Without interrupting, without looking at his phone. Just listening. When I spoke, he asked questions, not formal ones, but ones that made me think. For example, "Are you happy with what you do?" And I suddenly caught myself telling him things I had never told my husband. At first, I felt awkward. I felt guilty. Even though there was nothing between us. Just conversations. Just the warmth I was missing at home. But that just turned out to be too important. We started having lunch together. Sometimes he would bring me coffee, say I looked tired, and ask if everything was okay. I laughed and gave a neutral answer, but inside I felt as if someone had finally noticed me. One day we stayed late after work. I told him how I had quarreled with my husband, or rather, not quarreled, but simply, not talked again. Alex listened, remained silent, then said, "It seems like you just need someone to hear you." I almost cried. Not because he said anything special, but because it was true. He hit me right in the heart. I tried not to think about it. I told myself, it's just friendship, just the communication you're missing. But my heart knew that wasn't quite true. It wasn't even about love. It was about attention, about presence. When we were texting, I caught myself waiting for his messages. I checked my phone more often than I should have. It was wrong, I knew. But it was like a breath of air after a long dive underwater. Sometimes I caught his gaze. It lasted a little longer than it should have. And in those few seconds, there was everything I was missing: interest, warmth, response. Things I no longer saw at home. I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't want to destroy anything. I didn't want to start something new. I just wanted someone to understand that I was still here. That I still had life, emotions, and a desire to be heard. Alex didn't promise anything. He didn't say pretty words. He was just there. And that's probably why his presence became so dangerous. Because when I was with him, I felt something I no longer felt with my own husband, myself. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no dramatic moment when everything changed. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as if someone were slowly crossing a line, step by step, without noticing that they had already crossed it. That evening, we stayed late at work. Everyone else had left, and we were the only ones left in the office. It was raining outside, the drops tapping on the glass, and there was something comforting about the sound. We talked, again, about what was really important. I told him that everything was the same at home, that sometimes it seemed to me that my husband and I were living in different worlds. Alex listened. He didn't give advice or try to fix anything. He just listened. At some point, I fell silent. He looked at me and said, "You deserve to be heard." And that's when I felt something inside me break. He touched my hand. Very lightly, just a gesture of support. But there was more warmth in that touch than in all the hugs I had received in the last few months. I didn't pull my hand away. Not because I wanted to cheat, but because I didn't want to be invisible again. When he kissed me, it wasn't passionate, it wasn't planned. It was like a flash, short, quiet, almost sad. And in that moment, I didn't feel guilty. I felt like I was breathing for the first time in a long time. Then came silence. And realization. I drove home on the wet road, my hands shaking. A strange feeling in my chest. Not joy, not shame, just heaviness. I looked at the lights of the cars and thought, why? Not about him, about myself. Why did I need someone else's touch to remember that I was alive? At home, everything was as usual. He was sitting on the sofa, the TV flickering in the dark. I said hello, he nodded. I went to take a shower, and the water washed away not only the rain, but everything that had happened. But the memory did not wash away. I didn't know if it was cheating. Perhaps what I felt was less passion than longing. But that longing was the essence of it. The betrayal began long before that evening. In the silence, in the empty glances, in our unspoken words. I crossed the line not because I wanted someone else, but because I could no longer live without feeling alive. He didn't find out right away. For several weeks, I lived as if on pause, smiling, cooking dinner, going to work, but inside I was waiting for the moment of truth to come. And it did come. Not like a storm, not like a scene with shouting, but quietly, almost calmly. One evening he simply asked, "Are you with someone else?" I couldn't lie. Not because I wanted to be honest, but because I couldn't carry it inside me anymore. The words came out on their own. Yes. After that, silence hung in the room. The longest silence we had ever had between us. He didn't yell. He just sat down on the edge of the sofa, lowered his head, and said, "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to look in that direction." That night we finally talked. Not about betrayal, not about details, but about us. For the first time in a long time, honestly, without defensiveness. He said that for a long time he had felt like he was living next to a shadow of me. That he had tried to reach out, but I seemed to be pulling away. I replied that I had stopped talking when I realized he was no longer listening. We both cried. Not out of anger, but out of the realization that all this time we weren't enemies, we just lost touch. Not in a single day, not because of someone else, but because we stopped being there for each other. Then we lived together for a while longer, as if we were learning to talk again. Sometimes it seemed to me that everything could be restored. Sometimes it seemed too late. But every time we had a real conversation, I realized, this is what we've been missing all this time. Simple words. Honesty. I'm not justifying myself. Cheating is not a way out, not a solution. It's just a cry from a soul that has been silent for too long. And if I could turn back time, I wouldn't choose Alex. I would have chosen that evening when I first felt that there was a wall between us. And I would have said so. Loudly. Directly. Before it was too late. Now I know. Relationships don't die from cheating, from arguments, from distance. They die from silence. From the absence of words that could have saved them. And perhaps the most frightening thing about infidelity is not the act of betrayal itself, but how quietly it all leads up to it. No drama, no loud words. Just two people who one day stopped being someone each other could talk to.